Welcome, everyone. I think was that our 5 seconds? Are we good to go? So welcome, everyone. I'm going to share screen briefly just so you can see what it is we are doing today. Oh, there it is. Writing YA in a World of Identity, Sexuality, Violence with Michaela Thorn, Debby Dodds, Karen Eisenbrey, Kate Ristau, and Benjamin Gorman. That's me. And so I'm going to take a moment just to let everybody introduce themselves, because I think that that's part of what's so great about YOLO Book of Flood is you're finding these authors that you're making connections with so that you can then connect and get their books and become super fans. And that's what we would love. So I'm going to share screen so you can see everybody here, which also means you're going to see all of my tabs. There we go. So can everybody see that? And so first, Debby, who will be joining us any moment. Debby, I've already presented once this morning, so she's got a lot going on. And she's the author of Amish Guys Don't Call, which is a hilarious book. And then next we have Kate. And I'm going to exit and let Kate introduce herself. So here are Kate's images.
Hello, my name is Kate Ristau. I'm an author and a folklorist. You can see some of my books up on the screen there. We had Clockbreakers and we have Shadow Queen. And Clockbreakers is a story about a girl who, in a wheelchair, she gets a key to go back in time. And so it's just an excuse for me to go back and play in Greek mythology and Irish mythology and another kind of mythology that maybe I'll tell you all later what the third book is. I actually just finished the third book in this series too, so this is going to be exciting. And so I'm excited to talk a lot more about that book today too. So thanks, Ben. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And I'm going to go back so Debby can introduce herself. And so here is Debby's book. Debby, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes. Hi, I'm Debby Dodds. Sorry, I was having technical difficulties, which should be my middle name at this point. I wrote a book called Amish Guys Don't Call, and I'm working on my second book, novel length, but I've also had short stories published in different anthologies, which is how I got to know all of the wonderful folks over at Not a Pipe. Strongly Worded Women is the anthology that I have a short story published in that Ben was a publisher of. Yay! And that story is near and dear to my heart. And I'm also a former actress, although I've been acting a little bit during the quarantine remotely. So I guess I'm a current actress again, and worked at Disneyland, Disney World. And I'm a teacher and an academic tutor too.
Excellent. Welcome, Debby. And next up is Karen, and I will show you the covers of all of her books. She is one of the more prolific authors that I know. Let's see. So here's Karen. Karen, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Karen Eisenbrey, and I'm the author of two series, both of which we have two books out, and presumably will all go to three. The first is the Saint Rage series, which is a punk rock superhero mashup. And the other is the Daughter of Magic trilogy, which is more traditional wizard fantasy, but with a feminist take. And the third book in that series is coming out next year from Not a Pipe Publishing.
Yes, and it's so good. Yes, I'm very excited about those. And I mentioned I'm Benjamin Gorman. I'm gonna. Apparently, am I still sharing? There we go. So this is a little tricky, but I think it's kind of neat. I'm Benjamin Gorman. I'm a teacher, an author, co-publisher of Not a Pipe Publishing with Vivica Sheeran. So we've got an Oregon, New York connection there. She's in New York. And I'm a dad, a political activist, and a certified nerd. I'll own it. And so those are my titles there. And our last person, oh, actually, no, I will leave that up. Our last contributor was supposed to be Michaela Thorn, and it's really unfortunate that she couldn't make it. She had death in the family, and so she has not, we said this is lower on the priority list, but I do encourage you to check out her novel. And if you would like to see her visual art, she is the artist as well for the art inside the book itself is just amazing. And she's at Protective Spell 1 on Instagram. So it's unfortunate that she couldn't join us, but do check out her work. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Okay, so we are going to talk about sex. Now I've got all of your attention. We're also going to talk about violence, and we're going to talk about identity and the way that those manifest in young adult literature and some of the pitfalls. And so I'm going to start with, let's start with the topic of sex. And I'd like to ask our authors kind of to divide it out in terms of the sex act itself, but also romance, sexuality for young people. When we are writing for young people, when we are writing with their parents in mind as well, and we're always thinking about crossover. How do you handle that? So let's start with let's start with Debbie, because in Amish Guys Don't Call, you tackle this. So how did that play out for you when you were writing that one?
First of all, I never wrote Amish Guys Don't Call to be YA. It was marketed, and my publisher decided to go YA because it features a 16, 17-year-old protagonist. She has a birthday in the book. But I didn't necessarily write it that way. I have a kissing scene, and I make references to some of her friends, but she doesn't actually have go any further than kissing with Zach, so I didn't have to worry about that scene. And part of that was because I had a romance with an Amish guy who had not a lot of experience. So I had two characters who didn't have a lot of experience, so I didn't really have to worry about that as much. I will say this, after it was published, I got a lot of feedback from parents, especially from middle school parents of kids in middle school who like to read YA for high schoolers. And they said, oh, good. Like we can have this in our middle school library. Librarians told me that, or parents said, oh, I'm glad that I can say okay, because a lot of students like to read up, 15-year-olds like to read about 19-year-olds, and 12-year-olds like to read about 16-year-olds. So that was a benefit that I didn't plan on, but it was a good thing it turned out for the marketing of the book.
And I won't ruin the protagonist's mom's joke, but it's pretty great, and that's probably the most risque thing in the novel. And so now you've had a little teaser. Go read the book and look for mom's joke.
Commentary on that mom comment at the end, which I won't ruin either. But it was basically a joke I took from Seinfeld, which aired in the 90s. And I didn't think it was that risque a joke, but I did get some comments on Goodreads about the mom's comment. And I thought, wow, I thought it was like a pretty PG type of comment, but some people really don't like to hear about female anatomy at all in any way. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of, and that's interesting that it can show up on primetime television. This wasn't a late night kind of joke, right?
Yeah,
but
like
some parents are like, I don't want my child exposed to that, that joke, and yet it felt very much like the kind of thing a mom would say, and especially that character. Like, it was totally in character for her. So, Karen, you've written about romance and sexuality in both fantasy and in, I guess gospel is, contemporary fantasy. I mean, there's a fantasy element, but it's very realistic. How did you manage that?
Well, with the St. Rach books, especially the first one, I wanted to steer clear of it being a romance. Yeah. But I knew that, well, these are teenagers. They'll have a variety of different experiences and amounts of experience and what they are interested in, what they're curious about. So that first book ended up being full of crushes of various and a variety of requirement of the crushes. I knew early on, oh, Barbara is going to get some help from a gorgeous guy, a popular guy. And I didn't want it to go in the direction of, and in the end, he asks her to the prom. So I decided, okay, he's gay and he's out, so she knows it. And she still has a crush on him, but she realizes she doesn't have a chance. Meanwhile, he has a crush on someone that he thinks he doesn't have a chance with. And somebody else has a crush on someone else and gets together with that person. And so it's just a lot of that kind of stuff, a little bit of kissing. The second book, where the characters are older, I decided, okay, they're 18 now, they're going to college, and some of them are in actual relationships. Some have broken up with boyfriends and girlfriends. And so I decided, okay, what if everybody in Barbara's circle has had sex except for her? And she feels like she's behind. And she has one other friend who she's pretty sure has no experience too. And so it goes through this silly, awkward, comedic thing of, okay, we're doing this with each other just so we're not the only ones who don't know what it's like. And I wrote it for laughs, but it ends up having an impact on both of them. And I know people who did that when they were 16, 17, 18 years old, where they decided, okay, I'm going to sleep with my friend just so when we have relationships, we're not doing it for the first time. And so I made that scene as awkward and yet positive as I could, because that was the other thing. It's like, okay, here's a girl making this choice for herself, and this boy making this choice for himself, and it's gonna be weird and awkward and strange, but ultimately positive for both of them, because they like each other well enough and they respect each other, and it's consensual. And I decided, if I'm writing any kind of sex scenes, it has to be like that. I don't want it to be somebody having a terrible experience.
It was certainly not a terrible experience. It was cringe. The word my son would have used was cringy. Like, it's super awkward. You can feel that awkwardness. One of the things I liked about it is she's really the one who suggests the idea. And so it's not, here's this guy who's kind of skeezy and he's like, hey, here's this plan I've got to convince you to sleep with me. She's like, this is something I need for my emotional kind of well-being. And he's like, okay, but it's still super uncomfortable.
Well, and really her idea is she thinks she's doing something for him.
Right.
Because she realizes, oh, there's this girl who likes him, who he likes, and he has no idea how to make a move. And now he's going on tour with his dad's band. And she's like, okay, no way is your first experience going to be with a groupie. Yeah. And he agrees that that's probably better to do something with her.
Well, and one of the things that I liked was that you handled then when they meet up again the next time. Like, and so that's that.
A whole different level of awkwardness.
I think that was even more cringy for me, was the next meeting. So, if folks are into that kind of, it felt very real. Like, that's teenagers learning about sexuality and romance. So, Kate, in Shadow Girl specifically, the time frame is so compressed. It's such an exciting story. If folks have not read this, it happens. The whole thing happens very fast, and there is a romance element, but it's kind of forced into that time frame and all the other excitement that's going on. So how did you navigate that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that it happens so quickly. And, in the course of like the beginning of a relationship, like you I wanted it to feel really natural. And, the funny part, Ben knows a little bit about this, but when I was originally writing this book, the very first draft, it was a story about, this girl who gets taken from our world into the fairy world. And then she comes back as a teenager to kind of discover what happened in like her past and with her family. And so in the very original draft of this book, there was this prince, and like the prince like went on the journey with her, and and eventually like saved her in a bunch of different scenarios, and then crosses over into the fairy world with her at the end of this book. And I got to the end of this book, and somebody said, "You wrote like an entire book that you go into our world, but she never meets any humans." And because the prince is actually like a fairy prince, and I was like, it's actually like a really decent point. So I started revising, and I'm a huge fan of revision. And so as I revised, I wrote in this character named Hennessy. And so as I'm writing this character in, and I'm liking her more and more too. And by the end of the book, I'm like, why do we even need this prince? So then the next draft, I wrote the prince out. And so a lot of you already know that over the course of the book, Anya like starts to very slowly fall in love with Hennessy, because it's just the beginning of it, right? And so you see those little sparks of romance, but for some people it's surprising, because sometimes when you're having the very beginning of a relationship, it's not really obvious that you're not immediately falling in love, right? You're like, that person's cool, that person's like super cool. So you see that kind of develop over the course of the book. And then the second and third books, you get to develop it a little bit more, but it's still, like Ben was saying, that super compressed time frame. So you see these little sparks of joy and these little moments, and a little bit of angst because we're in YA. But yeah, so that was kind of how I wrote that relationship and thought about that relationship.
Well, and I wanted to ask you, I wanted to ask Michaela and then you about sexual orientation, because in Michaela's Tooth and Claw, the main character is bi, and it is very clear from the beginning she's got a girlfriend. Like, that's up front. And then there's a male love interest later in the story. And so it's never, the character doesn't say, hello, I'm bi. Like, this is just something that it feels very natural. And I think about, the students that I work with, my son's generation, and the way that this will just be a lot less of something that is where people feel like they have to announce and label themselves in that way. It's just, oh yeah, by the way, I never mentioned it, but right. And so how did that evolves in Shadow Girl in this very subtle way as well, where I found myself halfway through the book going, oh, I didn't realize she was gay. Okay. And so what was the thought process around that?
And I think that's the thing about writing in these fantasy worlds and writing in the fairy world, where like there wasn't a question of like of am I gay, am I straight, like what's my sexuality, what's my identity. Like it was just you were doing what you wanted to do. Like, and so for Anya and for Hennessy, like they were just attracted to each other, and Hennessy didn't have to. Hennessy's not the person that would sit around and contemplate it. And Anya didn't even know that that was something that you did. So she fell for Hennessy, and so we didn't have to deal with all of this cultural baggage that comes with, writing LGBTQ plus characters right now. Like we got to come in and just see somebody like as they're really just falling in love with somebody else, which I think is the real story. And Benjamin, you're pointing it out perfectly in terms of like, I love that kids now get to read books and see these relationships develop, and it's just a natural thing, because it really is just a natural thing.
Well, Karen, one of the cool things about the Daughter of Magic series is the way you had to, instead of avoiding cultural baggage, you had to create cultures and essentially say, okay, how is sexuality in this culture and how is sexuality in this other culture and how do those interact? But you had to make up these cultural groups in that epic fantasy world. There's no crossover. It's not Portal Fantasy at all. That's one of the things I not to knock Portal Fantasy, but I really like the kind of pure epic high fantasy element of that YA story. And it meant you had to do the work of saying, what are the Aklaka, this ethnic group, and what are the Eucardian, that cultural group, and how does sexuality manifest for them? What was the thought process as you were going through and creating those?
I don't remember because it's been so long, but I sort of based Eucardian culture is kind of similar sort of, to ours, but like 100 years ago or whatever. And then I thought, okay, so I'm just going to make the Aklaka different from that. And so they're just more open to all kinds of differences, different kinds of relationships. Their people are encouraged and allowed to have a series of sexual partners, love interests, whatever you want to call them, and they can form a long-standing relationship. They can live together, but they aren't married until they have a child. And when they have a child, it's not like they choose to get married, they are. and that's when any kind of ceremony would be held. And so I brought Luskel, who's familiar with that culture, but grew up in Eucardian culture where people choose each other, get married, have children, unless they're wizards, in which case they do have a little more freedom to kind of do whatever they want. And she has a good friend among the Aklaka who is steeped in his own culture and thinks that she has agreed to be his permanent partner when she's more interested in a temporary fling. And so we get some of that awkwardness and hard conversations where they have to figure that out. And I'm enjoying where that is going in the later books that I write. It's like, okay, well, why did he think that about her? And I'm getting more into his own personality, plus the culture, plus a vision that he thought he had. And so it's interesting to play with cultures that are different enough that it's easy to make a mistake and then have to unravel it after the fact.
Well, and at its heart, that's Debbie's story too. In our world, is this culture clash and the way ideas about relationships are very different. In one place in Pennsylvania, but you've got these different cultures represented. So, Debbie, how did you think about that in terms of a culture clash and the way it would manifest in terms of the way those characters thought about sexuality?
That culture difference was one of the most compelling parts of writing this book for me, because I grew up in Lancaster County, and we moved there at a time. I was in 5th grade, so I was like a little sponge, and I was always very interested in the Amish. They are very much a closed community. I tried to talk to as many Amish people as I could. I had some mini shunning incidents when I would try to talk to people where they would actually physically turn their back on me until I left them. But then I also had a really nice older Amish lady who told me a wonderful story about a train ride she went on one time that I couldn't include in the book. But and I got a lot of information from reading blogs of Amish people, and the ex-Amish people, excuse me. Amish people don't blog so much, but ex-Amish people about, and this kind of goes into, I want to make it clear, this is not about the sex, this is about the violence part of what we're talking about, because they're unfortunately, because in the Amish religion and tradition, they don't go to the police. So there are sexual assaults. There was a very well broadcast case of incest and rape that just came up in the Amish community. And quite a few community members knew about it. But if you apologize, it's not reported to the police, and then it can keep going on, unfortunately. And so I do have a scene where Zach tells Sam about this and about how it's one of the things that has made him leave that and trying to get an education, but that he's hoping that he'll make a documentary film about it one day. And that came from, as I said, a lot of reading of blogs and testimony from people in the Amish community. But I try to be extremely respectful of that, because certainly in the non-Amish community, there are things that happen too. And so I didn't want to, but when you have a culture that does promote secrecy and is very male oriented. The men eat, the women serve the men, and then they eat in the kitchen a lot of times. And the men make all the decisions, and it's very male based to the community. So that was another thing when Karen was talking, and she said she wanted to make sure that her female characters were the ones driving it. The first kiss between Sam and Zach, Sam kisses Zach. Zach does not kiss Sam. She kind of lunges forward and goes for it. And that made a lot more sense to me, even though she did have a lot of experience. She wasn't Amish. So it made a lot more sense that she would be the more forward one in the relationship. But yeah, so that was very interesting to me, of trying to portray the different cultures.
Well, and that's a good segue into our next topic about violence. So, so often in fantasy literature, especially fantasy, sci-fi, that kind of thing, there is a lot of violence because violence is a proxy for conflict. Often, how are we going to show conflict in the story? Well, they'll punch each other. But then when we start getting into YA and we're dealing with sexuality, romance, and we're dealing with violence as a means of demonstrating conflict, there's this real hesitance to recognize that sexuality and violence often are, connected. And the series that comes to mind for me is, if any of the folks watching right now, you may have heard of this series called The Hunger Games. It was kind of popular. And it's one of the things that has always irked me about it, and yet I understand, but I feel conflicted about it because I've taught those books as well, is you've got this circumstance where violence is essentially being promoted by the state. Like they are supposed to be violent. And you've got a bunch of teenagers in isolation, and there's no sexual violence. And I understand why the author decided we're not going to do that, but it always struck me as unrealistic. Teenagers without boundaries encouraged to violence, sexual violence would be a part of it. And so, how have you navigated sexual violence in your work? Debbie, you've handled that with it being kind of third party. So Zach's referencing the fact that this is real, this happens in the world, but you're not depicting it. Kate, how did you navigate that?
Yeah, I do have one scene particularly in Shadow Girl where both Anya and Hennessy encounter a bunch of boys, and it's this thing of the Anya being from fairyland, basically, trying to figure out what's even going on, right? And seeing this, and you're seeing it from her perspective of these things slowly starting to escalate. And Hennessy coming in from a very different perspective of knowing that this stuff happens, right? And knowing that violence is a possibility and is an actuality, right? And I think really in this, in the second book, Shadow Queen, I start to get a little bit further into Hennessy's backstory of kind of dealing with abuse and dealing with these situations where she didn't have power. That's the main kind of theme that I'm thinking about, is that issue of power, because violence is so often about power, and people not having power and other people exercising power over other people. And so, in the first book, they're fighting really hard to get their power, and in the second and the third books, they have power. So now it's a question of how are they going to use their power to not make these situations happen, or create scenarios and create worlds where it doesn't happen. So that really gets to that question of, the worlds that we're creating and the worlds that our characters want to live in, are they going to are they going to do those things to create those worlds? Are they going to, what are they going to fight for? And that's what I love about, big epic fantasy. And somebody said it in the comments there too, about high fantasy setting being a way to discuss all kinds of cultural baggage without it being awkward, right? That we can take on these big, huge, important themes, and really force people to confront them and think about them, that those scenarios of, Debbie was talking about, the worlds of secrecy or not talking about things, and just pushing them to the side. We can really confront them in literature if we want to.
Well, yes. And I think that your point about power is incredibly important. And fantasy might allow us to make that point to young adult readers who need to hear it, that sexual violence is not about romance. It's about power. And that's something that people need to, I think, you know, we have an ability to, you know, kind of a platform to remind young people this is not about your self-esteem and about your, you know, whether or not this person likes you. This is about power. And so you could do that in kind of a metaphorical way, or you can do that in a very literal way in literature, but we can, you know, remind students of that, students, say teacher, you know, my young readers, it's a different hat I'm wearing as an author, but I think of, you know, I do think of my students as I am writing. What is it that they need to hear about sexuality? And you know, I do think about that idea that a lot of my students need to understand that distinction, that when things get to that place where it's non-consensual, it's not about romance anymore, it's about power. Karen, how have you didn't have, I'm trying to remember, there's no sexual violence in any of yours. How did you wrestle with that? Oh no, but there is there's the other man.
It's implied in the backstory of that there's this guy that most of the girls kind of know. Yeah, don't have anything to do with him. He has this reputation, and almost does something with a girl who is not familiar with his reputation. And this is one of the times when Barbara actually uses her powers in a kind of a violent way. But it was one of those things where other people are better equipped to write that story. So I didn't want that to be the story. And in fact, originally the story was going to end with that scene. And then I thought, no, I don't want this guy to be the villain of the story. He's not important enough to be the villain of the story, and I don't want to make it about that. But I inserted that because that's a thing that happens in that age group.
Well, and I think that brings us to a question that Evan Morgan Williams asked in the chat, which I think is a really good one, which is, why do YA writers so often get held to a higher standard when it comes to violence? You know, in movies, we're allowed to, you know, watch, you know, here's a battlefield of superheroes killing thousands of people. Here's, you know, Superman, where Metropolis, the entire city is destroyed. That's fine for kids to see. But, you know, why do you think, I mean, I have my own theories, but I'd like to hear from all of you. Why do you think that YA writers do get kind of called on the carpet for violence, as, you know, sexual violence or violence otherwise, in kind of a different way? Debbie, do you have a theory about that? Oh, Debbie froze. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Debbie's frozen. We'll come back to Debbie. Kate, how about you? Because you've worked with middle grade as well. And so what do you think causes that kind of disconnect? You know, why do we have to think about violence in our work in a kind of a different way than in other media?
It's so hard, because if you read a lot of my work, like, I've totally embraced that idea of, you know, like how we can use books and novels from an educational standpoint too, to like show people like how worlds can be different and how we can like interact with each other and what's okay and what's not okay. So that idea of sexual violence came up earlier, where you know, in the third book that I'm writing for the Shadow Girl series, like, I really kind of work on this idea of calling out, right? Like, so when I have some people saying inappropriate comments, right, and then kind of demonstrating how we can respond to those, right, in a way that's like funny or weird, or like that can make you feel comfortable, like that it doesn't always have to be, you know, escalating to these really like, yeah, violent moments. But at the same time, like, you can see that I'm doing it naturally, of like, I want it to be a thing where like people can really, you know, because we're writing for students, but we're also writing for kids, and we're writing for like young adults, and we're writing for like what they read is really going to determine how they see the world and what they think of the world too. Like, and so I think that is our responsibility, and I don't know why it is, but I totally like take it and I run with it, because I like want to help them like live in their better world, like what they want their world to be.
Yeah, well, and this is where I get a little cynical, but you know, for writers watching, we have a different audience in the sense that the people making the purchasing decisions often aren't our readers. And so, if it comes to a movie or a YouTube video or whatever, 14, 15-year-olds are making those decisions on their own. And if they decide, I want to watch this video that's got a lot of violence, the kid is making that choice. We are making our decisions, certainly bearing in mind those kids. I mean, those are the people we are serving. But there's an intermediary. We need to make sure that parent is going to say, I feel comfortable handing this book to my kid, and that teacher is saying, I feel comfortable handing this book to 30 kids at a time. And so when we are thinking about our work, we've got this other audience, and, whereas an individual 14-year-old says, I'm totally fine with this, that teacher says, I'm fine with this for that 14-year-old, but I'm really nervous about the blowback I'm going to get from some of the parents if I assign this to all my kids. So we have to make those decisions in this, in this kind of fraught way. And it can incline us to be overly conservative, I think, too, where we'll say, oh, no, I that would never fly. When in fact, sometimes that's what makes an individual teacher or parent say, this is why I want, I want my young person in my life to be exposed to this, is because it is handled thoughtfully. But we do have to handle it more thoughtfully than, a YouTuber. And so, Karen, as you go through and you're making those decisions, are you thinking about teachers, parents, that kind of thing? Or are you thinking mostly about
I'm thinking about myself and about the young people I have known. Mm-hmm. I actually, when my kids were pretty young, we were reading the Animorphs series, and I read all those books out loud. And the violence in there is horrendous if your imagination is good enough, but it's written in such a way that the reader can self-censor. And I took something away from that, which is that, okay, you can have violence occur, but you don't have to be graphic about it. And the reader will imagine as much as they want. I don't really like to read violence that much, and so I tried to subvert the superhero trope of the, destroying the city or the huge fights with monster alien villains or whatever. And so most of the violence in my books actually happens off stage or in the backstory, or it's just short and sharp, and the perpetrator is just as shocked as everyone else, and most of it's perpetrated by Barbara, because she has rage powers, and that means that she's not always in control, and she does things that she's like, oh, whoa, what did I just do? And she is as shocked as anyone. But more often, I would write it up to a point where you would expect something violent to happen and then take it in another direction.
Well, and in many ways, one of the things I like about your stories is that violence is more realistic. Even though it's coming from superpowers, violence in the real world is much, much faster than we ever see it in movies and on television, where it's, turned into this aesthetic exercise, and, it can be beautiful. It's a dance routine, right? But it goes on for 5 minutes. That is not the way violence works in the real world. It is shocking and it is fast. And so I like that in your work, the characters are stunned. I mean, we don't live in a world where we are frequently punched in the face. And it hurts, and people are surprised by it.
And it hurts. And if you're the puncher, it hurts your hand. Right. And everybody's going, ow.
One of the things that's always struck me about in the world of film, it's completely acceptable to have a scene where somebody will hit someone over the head with something heavy, and essentially the writer gets to decide if this merely knocks them out or kills them, as though anybody has that kind of perfect dexterity to go, this is convenient for the plot. The security guard is merely left unconscious. Like, that's, in real life, somebody would do one of two things. They would either hemorrhage and die, or they would go, ow! There's no, but in movies, it's convenient. So writing realistic violence, I think, but I also like your point of the camera pans, and sometimes we can leave that to the reader to figure out what is going on. We don't need to, and that's the way I handle sexuality, I admit. Like, I'm not going to describe sexuality in a graphic way in a book for kids. I think it's really appropriate to acknowledge, sexuality happens, I don't think it needs to be described in so the camera pans to the fireplace. That's the way I handle it.
Yeah.
If
Debbie,
I'm not freezing, I have sorry.
we're glad you're back.
Sorry, yeah. Anyway, I think, and somebody may have made this point, but like emotional violence to me is more devastating a lot of times. And so writing Amish Guys Don't Call, I had a young female protagonist who's very harshly bullied. And to me, that was more emotional and traumatizing as a young person than watching, two kids duke it out in the parking lot. And, even if there was blood or whatever, like the emotional violence was so rough. Now, having said that, I'm not afraid of violence. I did horror movies as a young actress. So like, I'm quite interested in the metaphoric violence and what things stand for. Ben, you and I have talked about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I love like the ultra violence in that and what it kind of represents in an emotional plane. Yeah. So the one that I'm writing now, and the one I wrote for Strongly Worded Women has some violence at the end. Because it's making a commentary on the male-female dynamic and kind of a toxic masculinity culture. And then the one that I'm writing now, I'm just finishing a first draft, but I don't think it's going to be YA because there's a puppy decapitation in it. So yeah. so I don't know. I haven't gone super into detail of describing him. Even just saying that, every single one of you were like, whoa,
See, in my sequel I'm working on right now, the puppies are puppy werewolves and they're actually the aggressors. And I feel like that's got to be a great selling point. Like when people find out there are baby puppy werewolves that kill people, I think people are just going to be like, that is so awesome. I'm hopeful people will be as excited about puppy werewolves as I am.
I am. I think it's super cute.
They're adorable until they all jump on you and rip you to shreds. So,
So
I saw a question go by about verbal violence, about swearing, which I'm guessing is directed at me because there's a lot of F-bombs, especially in the first Saint Rage book. There are fewer in the second one because the character who is responsible for most of them isn't in the story as much. But that came out of just listening to how teenagers actually talk. And afterwards, I thought, gee, maybe I should have toned that down or used euphemisms or cut away. But I didn't, which means that a lot of parents are going to object to it more than I think the teen readers that it's aimed at are going to be fine with it. But their parents and teachers might go, this would not get a PG-13 because
I had two F-bombs in my book, which was the one that was not published by Ben. I had two F-bombs and I felt like they were appropriately placed. Certainly what 16 or 17-year-old would say. And my publisher made me take them out. And I had to get really creative with curse words and, things like douche canoe and ass hat. And, people come back to me and they're like, you have some pretty creative swear words in there. And I was like, I had to. So.
But that is that tension. Do we want to write for a YA audience that is composed of teenagers who actually do speak that way? I promise you that is the way they sound in the halls every single day. That is perfectly normal and functional grammar, and it is acceptable. It doesn't even bother me anymore. It's the way that they speak and it works.
Yeah.
And then this tension of, and it's interesting because when you get a bunch of teachers together outside of school, that's the way we all talk too. But never in the same room as the teenagers. So we all have these separate languages that we use in these different spheres. And I just tell students that's okay. That's learning how to, change your register depending on the setting. That's totally appropriate. But it's just code switching. But it does create this weird circumstance where as writers, we are writing in the code of the teacher, the teacher who's concerned about the most conservative parent in the room, rather than what would the 36 kids like. And so I totally respect Karen's choice to just say, I'm going to write this the way kids speak. that kind of realism. And yet I also understand, Debbie, where your publisher was coming from, where they're going, yeah, but we want to get this into classrooms. And so that's a real tension.
So related to Jeannie's point that just popped up on the screen, that not all of us talk that way. You all know that I'm like an episode of The Good Place where like I'll constantly be swearing, but it's all like, what the pancakes, like for sure. And so it was fun for me in like the Shadow Girl books to be replacing our swear words with like fairy swear words, like, and then for kids to think like, she keeps saying craw, what do you think she means when she yells craw like that, like, and then like, so I have an idea of what those words mean, but they're from fairyland, so it's not, it twists it a little bit and just makes you think a little bit differently, which I love to do.
And that's how I navigated it in corporate high school, is set in 100 years in the future. Well, the swear words have changed. And so they can still swear, and it is very clear from context that word is, offensive. And in fact, there's a reference to the fact that the corporation that has taken over the world has a prohibited word list, and the kids are not allowed to say certain things. And so they've navigated that by making up new swear words. And that's how language works. So that is kind of a way around it, is to, what was the one from Battlestar Galactica? They would frack everything, and so I think that's a very functional way, and our students go, oh yeah, they translate that very quickly. So that is a means. So the last thing I wanted to ask about, and what is our time? Are we an hour and a half or an hour?
Like 5 to 10 minutes, I think.
5 to 10 minutes left. Okay, so I want to get into kind of broader questions of identity. And I know it seems weird to go from sex to violence to identity, but I think the through line there is, these are things that we need to wrestle with and be thoughtful about. And maybe, as Evan was pointing out, maybe more thoughtful about than in other kinds of media. So as you were thinking about your characters, as you were thinking about, and in future projects as well, how do you think about the identities of your characters and the composition in terms of what you ought to have, what is realistic, what fits the story? Who wants to tackle that one first?
I'll pop in just to say, I updated my era. It was inspired by a story that happened in the 80s. And when I updated the era, I didn't think that where I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in the 80s was very, very white. And it's not so much anymore. And I actually kind of kick myself because I missed an opportunity, I think, to have more people of color, people with, I did a little bit of updating, but I really feel like I could have done more. Because I fictionalized and because I changed the era and everything. And I'm certainly more aware of that now that I'm writing my second book, even though I am actually writing a book that's taking place in the 70s and 89. But I am finding ways, because I feel like I missed that opportunity. It was nice that I have the culture of the Amish in there and that there's that diversity for that reason, which I'm was aware of and I'm proud of, but I'm certainly more aware this time of making sure that I'm more representative with my secondary characters.
Yeah. Karen, how about you? How did you navigate questions of identity? Because you've got a real diverse cast.
Yeah. Well, I knew right away that I was going to have this gay kid, and then I realized, and the guitarist in the band is just coming out as a lesbian. In the second book, I have a trans character. There's a few bisexual characters who pop in and out, and I mostly try to handle it as, these people are just here and they're part of the story, and that isn't the biggest thing about them. It's just a thing about them, and in most cases, they're either they've dealt with it, and so it's not like this is a big coming out story, but so they're mostly comfortable with themselves, but sometimes things happen where somebody else is not comfortable with them. But mostly the book isn't about that. It's just, look, these are just kids like other kids.
Yeah, but one of the things I liked about it is it wasn't portrayed like oh, this is tacked on in one sentence and it's not intrinsic to this character. Like, no, this really is who this person is. And so I didn't feel like it was dismissive of difference in a, it was just very real. Like the way these kids interact is tolerant and inclusive, and at the same time this cast is diverse. I really liked that. Kate, how about you? When you were, because you've got some identity in a fantasy story and also set in a different country, you had a lot of different kind of identity questions to think about. Another country and another world and another.
Just basically all over the place. Like, and I also do it with my other series too, where we're going back into Greek mythology and Irish mythology. And yeah, I think I approach it similar to how Karen and Debbie are talking about too, where these identities are just part of who these people are. But at the same time, like especially in YA and I kind of think of middle grade in terms of layers, that there's layers of things that you pull back. So there's trauma in middle grade, but for some kids, they'll see deeper into the layers of the trauma. And for other kids, they're going to be on the surface layer because they haven't had some of those experiences. So that's also how I just think about my books, where, there'll be these elements of trauma and these elements of like things that these kids have gone through because of like who they are and their identity and how they live in the world, right? And then for our readers are going to start to understand and learn from that, and they're going to get little pieces of it. But for the kids who've been going through this constantly, they're going to be able to see themselves and identify with it and say, like, I've had that experience and that's straight up stupid. So being able to like see themselves reflected back in there, but also like not pushing it too much for the kids who haven't gone through that experience yet, because they don't have all the tools to handle it. So I don't necessarily think it's that we shouldn't talk about this stuff, but I also think that like that's that YA responsibility of like kids got to have the tools to like encounter the things that we're talking about too.
I will say too, for writers who are watching, I highly, highly recommend sensitivity readers. I know it's an investment. Sensitivity readers should be paid. They are doing work for you. So it shouldn't be, hey, I'm going to reach out to my friend who's a person of color and just kind of, expect them to do this work. Hire a pro, hire somebody who can look in your work and say, you might not have thought of this because you're a cishet white male. And so, for example, for one of my books, I have a lesbian sex scene. Well, guess what? I've never had lesbian sex before. And so it was really valuable for me to have somebody else to say, that's not really what it's like. And, this needs to be described in a different way. And so hire somebody, get somebody so that you get it right, because part of getting it right is also showing respect. You're saying you are valuable enough that if I tell a story and I'm not part of that group, I respect that group enough to get that, to make sure I'm telling that story correctly. Do we have any other? So we've got very little time because we've gone over, which is the way I always roll. But does anybody have any questions? We'll navigate. We'll tackle those in the chat as quickly as we can. But thanks for everybody who's been, following and commenting, and any questions that we can answer about YA and how we handle these challenging things in our YA work. I want to make sure it's tricky when it's the chat because you've got to give people time to type. So there are people who right now are like, I'm ready. I've got this great question. And then
I second what you say about sensitivity readers, although, not although, and in addition, in writing my first draft, in this work in progress that I'm working on, I have a lot of questions about Judaism. And luckily, I have a really good friend who's a rabbi.
Yeah.
So it's been really nice to call up my friend Rabbi Wolpe and say, can you help me out with this? Because I don't understand this. Or why would a Jewish person maybe do this or make this choice? And, that as I'm writing it has informed the writing of it a lot. So that's been really fun for me.
Well, yes, I think that's an excellent place for us to end. Find somebody who knows what they're talking about. Get their help. So we're going to sign off. Thank you all for watching, and we're going to wave, and we will see you all later.